Hey everybody, it's Chris Sims here from ComicsLines.com, and this is Here's the Thing. Now, if you're a regular viewer of the program, you'll know that a few weeks ago I talked about Angel Punisher, Punisher Volume 4, the story where FrankenCastle killed himself and was then resurrected by angels to fight demons who, it turned out, had been responsible for his family's death in Central Park, and who gave him a coat full of heaven guns that he could pull out whenever he wanted a gun. If you missed that show, the short version is that I don't think it's very good, for what I think are fairly obvious reasons. But that episode got a lot of people asking me what I thought of another story where the Punisher was given a kind of supernatural bent, and that is the very recent, relatively speaking, FrankenCastle. Now, FrankenCastle is kind of hard to explain, but if you remember that earlier show, you'll remember that I talked about how the Matt Fraction and Rick Remender run on Punisher that came out of the Punisher returning to the Marvel Universe after basically being isolated in this Garth Ennis, Steve Dillon, Gorlin Parlov, Punisher Marvel Knights, Punisher Max run for 8 years. That series had sort of brought in a few supernatural elements of its own. And it did. Because, see, the idea of that was to return Punisher to the Marvel Universe, with all that entails. Supervillains, magic, monsters. The same things that I think Christopher Golden and Tom Sniegoski and Bernie Wrightson had been attempting to do in Punisher Volume 4, that they just went about in what I would consider to be a pretty bad way. Now, the supernatural stuff came up in an interesting story where the Punisher is fighting the Hood, who's a sort of mystically themed villain, who was very big for a while. He was originally created in a miniseries by Kyle Hotz on art and Brian K. Vaughan of Why the Last Man and Pride of Baghdad and several other things that you've probably read. Saga's probably the big one these days, but Why the Last Man, probably at the time. So the story had a lot of supernatural elements to it, and one of them was that FrankenCastle's family was resurrected in an attempt to bribe him, an attempt to stop him from being the Punisher by giving him back his family. And the sort of question was, is the Punisher because his family died, or is it because it was always in him, or is it because, is he too far gone to ever come back? And the answer to that in that story was yes, he is too far gone to ever come back. He is never not going to be the Punisher now. Which is a very interesting thing, because it really lines up with the Ennis characterization of the Punisher. If you think back to Welcome Back Frank, which I have on the shelf right over there, you'll remember the scene where Joan the Mouse asks him why he's the Punisher. Like, is it to protect people? And he says, no, I kill them because I hate them. And that's a very blunt answer, and it's a very simple answer, but for the Punisher, that's kind of all there is. So the Rick Remender and Matt Fraction run at the beginning did sort of involve a lot of those supernatural elements. Now, as the story went on, you got to the point where the book stops being Punisher and becomes FrankenCastle. And a lot of people didn't like this. And I'm not going to pretend like I don't understand why, because I do. I just think it's silly. The reason people didn't like it was because it was a drastic change for the Punisher. The Punisher is generally, as I said before, this very crime-oriented character. This guy who hunts down mobsters, or at the very least, criminals, as a dude with guns and military training. FrankenCastle took it in a really bizarre direction. You can probably guess what happened just by hearing the name of the story. The Punisher went after Daken, or Daken, I'm not really sure how you pronounce it, rockin' like Daken, and got cut up. Got his arms cut off, legs cut off, head cut off, and everything. And was then sent down into the sewers where his body washed up, and Morbius the Living Vampire sewed him back together with a bloodstone, which if you don't know about the bloodstones, we'll get to it. And he became a stitched-up Frankenstein's monster version of FrankenCastle. Hence, FrankenCastle. Genius. That is an amazing pun. I would say generally beware of comic books that the titles are puns, but in this case, A+. A+ on that one. Now, the reason people didn't like this is obvious. It's because Punisher is as close to a sort of crime men's adventure character that you're going to get in the Marvel Universe. But there's a problem with that. The problem is that the Punisher is part of the Marvel Universe. He first appears in Spider-Man, where he is sent after Spider-Man by the Jackal, who's the dude who made the clones. So you can't pull the Punisher away from that, no matter how hard you try. Realistically speaking. You can, if you're Garth Ennis, and you're Steve Dillon, and you're all the guys who worked on that book, you can pull the Punisher away into his own universe. And that's what Punisher Max is. Punisher Max ends with Jason Aaron coming on and kind of making it a weird adult Marvel Universe Punisher. It's got Kingpin and Bullseye and Elektra in it there at the end. But that's meant to be kind of their first appearance alongside the Punisher as a 70-year-old man. And the thing is, that was going on at the same time as FrankenCastle. So if you are a person who likes the Punisher, but you only like the Ennis stuff, if you only like the realistic crime stuff, then that was available. FrankenCastle was not that. Now, I should say, this is something that I meant to bring up in the last episode, that Phil Hester, who is an amazing artist, was the first convention sketch that I ever got. He said that Angel Punisher is only slightly more impossible than regular Punisher. That the very idea of the regular Punisher, like this unstoppable killing machine, is itself as silly as anything else. And I agree with him. But that's what you get in comics, right? So you can't have this character who's sort of inextricably rooted in this world where that really gets its start when a dude and his girlfriend and her brother and his best friend go to space to beat the commies and then come back, and one of them turns into a rock monster and one of them can set himself on fire, one of them stretches and one of them turns invisible. That's the world where he lives. Like it or not, that's Punisher in the Marvel Universe. In fact, here's how this story actually gets started. Norman Osborn, right? Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin. A guy who is best known for being an industrialist who flies around on a piece of sheet metal and throws Spider-Man's girlfriend off a bridge. He becomes basically the director of Homeland Security. And you might be asking yourself, well, Chris, that sounds improbable. But I should explain that it's because he shot an alien on TV. If you do that, you get to be in charge, I guess. That's what happens. So that story is about Punisher, kind of recognizing that Norman Osborn is a criminal. Because, again, Norman Osborn exists in the Spider-Man section of the Marvel Universe. Punisher exists in the section of the Marvel Universe. They would know each other. They would understand each other. It's the same reason Punisher fights Kingpin in the first few arcs of the Mike Baron series. So that's why Punisher goes after Daken, because Daken's part of his Dark Avengers team. So Punisher is going to go put a stop to these criminal Avengers. Because he's the Punisher, and he fights criminals. That's what he does. So that all makes sense. Now, then you get to the FrankenCastle stuff. And I gotta say, I love it. I love stuff that goes bonkers over the top. I really do. And it's generally regardless of what character it's happening to. I love it. You could put I'm trying to think of a sort of realistic Marvel character, and there are none. The grittiest crime character in the Marvel Universe is a blind ninja lawyer whose girlfriend comes back from the dead all the time because of radiation and ninja magic. So yeah. FrankenCastle. It's improbable. It's weird. It's an interesting take on the character for me, but for some people it's a bridge too far. And some people say, now what's the difference between that and Angel Punisher? And here's the deal. Here's the thing about FrankenCastle. FrankenCastle wasn't a retcon. Angel Punisher was. Angel Punisher went back and said, here is something you didn't know about the origin of this character that changes everything that character does. It changes the reason for the skull on his chest. It changes the circumstances of his origin. It changes his entire deal. Like I said, that's the thing that's off-putting about it for me, is that Punisher becomes this guy who's not hunting down criminals and killing them. He's part of human sacrifice for the devil. FrankenCastle was not. FrankenCastle was just the next thing that happened to that dude. It doesn't go back and change anything. And in fact, if you read it, it's actually very consistent with the characterization of the Punisher that had happened up to that point. He just kind of wakes up as a monster and is really understandably angry about it. He's not happy about being a monster. He's not happy about being alive. Because if you really get into the psychology of the Punisher, that dude kind of wants to die doing what he's doing. That's his goal. It also brings in an interesting point about the Marvel Universe, which is that crime is not limited to the people you expect. Now, this is where the Legion of Monsters comes in, and this is where I have to take another digression, because the Legion of Monsters is another one of my favorite things that has happened in Marvel Comics. The Legion of Monsters goes back to the 70s. Now, Marvel, being created in the 60s and kind of taking advantages of cracks in the comics code that had already appeared, was way quicker out of the gate in capitalizing on the 70s horror trend than DC was. DC's horror comics, such as they were, you had your House of Secrets and the House of Mystery, Swamp Thing, stuff like that. But they really adhered to those strict guidelines. You couldn't have werewolves. You couldn't have Draculas. You couldn't have anything, really, because the code was designed not to protect kids with sanitized stories. It was designed to put EC out of business, and it did, essentially. Except for Mad Magazine, which they eventually sold to DC anyway. So, but Marvel was really able to get that stuff going in a much easier way than DC was. DC never really did, to be honest with you. They didn't really get around to horror comics until the late 80s, the early 90s, when all the Vertigo stuff was happening. It was really Alan Moore's Swamp Thing that really pushed it into being horror. Before that, Swamp Thing, as good as those stories are, and I do like those Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson stories, they're superhero takes on horror. Swamp Thing is he has this really weird Marvel Comics origin, but in the DC universe, and he just kind of fights weird things. Anton Arcane isn't really scary until the Alan Moore run. At least I don't think so. But then, with Vertigo, you get the explosion of, Hellblazer, and Preacher, even, is kind of a horror book in parts. But all that stuff happens later for DC, when they finally get around to doing it. With Marvel, they're, there in the 70s. Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night, The Zombie, Simon Garth, Monster of Frankenstein. All that stuff happens. Now, the problem is that, again, the Marvel Universe is a superhero universe, structurally speaking. And superhero universes have superhero teams. So all those characters got lumped in what I believe was an issue of Marvel Premiere called Legion of Monsters. And I have to believe this was just an attempt to secure a copyright by just going ahead and making it, because Legion of Monsters is such a great title. But there was only that one issue. And have Morbius the Living Vampire, Werewolf by Night, Jack Russell. Again, these puns. You gotta watch out for them. The Zombie, Monster of Frankenstein. Dracula was way too popular to be part of that team. Which is hilarious, thinking about it. Now that the prevailing idea is to put your most popular characters in a team book. Back then, team books were for characters who couldn't hold their own series, largely. You had, a couple anchor characters, but, who's reading Green Arrow in the 60s? Who's reading Hawkeye in the 70s? Not a lot of people. So you put, Captain America there to bring people in, and then you round out the cast. That's what Legion of Monsters was, because Dracula was hugely successful. Dracula runs for a long time, and it's great, because it's Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan. It's one of my all-time favorite comics, Tomb of Dracula. And if you go back and read it, it really does hold up. It reads like a contemporary WB show, almost. CW show, excuse me. I'm showing my age. So, cut to 2009-ish, I would say. That's about when FrankenCastle happens. The idea of the Legion of Monsters comes back, and you have these monstrous characters. The Morbius, Frankenstein, Nicantu, the Living Mummy, who's a favorite of mine. And they all kind of band together in the streets in New York, because the sewers in New York, because the Marvel Universe is really built on monsters. What's the first thing the Fantastic Four fight? It's a monster. Those things exist. Those things happen. So you have FrankenCastle, who shows up and kind of realizes, like the X-Men realized that the Morlocks are getting a way worse deal than they are, because they get to live in a mansion and the Morlocks have to live in the sewer, FrankenCastle realizes there's this entire population of unprotected people who have to deal with crimes that they can't report to anyone. They're even worse off than regular Marvel New York citizens, which are pretty worse off. If you read those comics, a lot of bad stuff happens, especially in Hell's Kitchen. I've been to Hell's Kitchen. It's kind of nice. But, I did not see any blind lawyer ninjas while I was there. Anyway. So, what it does is it gives you a chance to explore a side of the Punisher that hadn't been explored. This interesting piece of what's going on in a new setting. The Punisher's characterization remains consistent. Punisher's characterization in Punisher Volume 4, in Angel Punisher, it's not consistent at all. It's confusing. You don't really understand why he's doing what he's doing in the way that he's doing it. In FrankenCastle, he's just kind of dealing with what's happening to him in a way that's very consistent with his character. So I would say FrankenCastle beats the pants off Angel Punisher, because it's got consistency of characterization. And in a superhero book where logic is kind of unheard of, consistency of characterization is really all you have. FrankenCastle's pretty good. Also, it's got Elsa Bloodstone in it, and I love Elsa Bloodstone. But that is a topic for another time. If you've got something you'd like me to talk about on a future episode of Here's the Thing, then by all means, send me a question on Twitter, @TheISB, leave a comment on comicsalliance.com, and tune in next week for another episode. I've been Chris Sims. Have a great week, everybody.